Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. Today I have the pleasure of talking with a returning guest who is now actually actively promoting this very podcast with a charming YouTube video. Barney Decker, thank you very much for producing such an amazing YouTube video.
It was our pleasure. Thank you very much for sending the models. It was the least we could do.
The Space Hawk, such a beautiful sculpt, if there was any aspect of that period of Games Workshop, it is captured beautifully in the slightly Mad Max, certainly very heavily rooted in the North African campaign in World War II. Just some beautiful sculpts through that period of time.
Those really chunky boots, as you stick a model into a base, you're really aware of the feet. And I emailed you about the squats feet a little bit as well. I think there's this really interesting moment where you think, right, how do I get the feet to fit on the base right and get the right body weight balance? And that orc's got lovely chunky boots.
I'm reminded when I spent some time staring at Space Marines that they're actually modelled on the body of a 3-year-old child. The shape of the Space Marine is kind of chunky toddler-esque. And yes, it's interesting how the early body types of these miniatures have their own particular elements. But the thing that captivated me about those early Space Orcs is that they're sculpted by a gentleman called Kev Adams. And I mentioned in my discussion with Matthew the use of psychedelia in Games Workshop. And this is a topic that you also wanted to discuss a little bit.
Well, you seem to want to talk about it, and I see no reason why not to. I was going to say that I think I'm a bit of a post psychedeliast, I suppose. That would be my interest. I think Free are a fantastic band, and I really like. I was going to say Joni Mitchell, Joan Armour Trading.
Certainly.
I don't know if you know Don Juan's Reckless Daughter by Joni Mitchell. I think
yes.
In a and Hissing of Summer Lawns in a kind of lyrical way, I think they have their own psychedelic quality.
I think
I like to use the expression psychedelic quite a lot. When things start to get a bit intense and multifaceted and complex and colourful, and so I think it's a great idea and a great word.
As I was listening to the recording, I listened to it maybe twice. I edited it and then I listened to it before I put it out. I missed King Crimson in the Court of the Crimson King when I was describing psychedelic albums that I spent my childhood staring at. I think that is just such a beautiful album, both visually and also musically. But I guess for me, psychedelia, because living in the San Francisco Bay Area, it could be even more of a cliche here. So what I'm trying to do is see offshoots of this period, this music, this visual form, what have you, in just manipulations. And I see it in so much of Games Workshop's early work. I'm not sure, are you familiar with the Realm of Chaos books, the 2 hardcover books? And
I am. Yeah.
So, I think...
not closely, but yes, absolutely.
The grounding of this work as being just a huge part of the organ that has come since. Obviously, you look at a Primaris Space Marine, you don't see a lot of psychedelia. But the grounding of this company in these kind of works, and also Kev Adams. Kev Adams still sculpts to this day. I had some dialogue. I put up your video, actually, on a Vintage Games Workshop Facebook page.
Oh, great. Super.
One of the people who responded was a gentleman who releases Kev Adams' work currently. He's the contemporary fellow that, enables this just mind that has created so much deep fantasy to continue to produce miniatures to this day. So.
Which what do we call it? Publisher, Foundry, which company is that?
Oh, I think it's called Warmonger Miniatures, but he runs cyclical Kickstarters. So most of his business is keeping Kev Adams sculpting and running. He's got one currently associated with Space Goblins, which is just a genre that Kev Adams could always delve into. There's also one called Orcs in Shorts currently, which is a vignette to desert rats as orcs. So combining these two, not the German side, not the Afrika Korps, but the desert rats as orcs this time. But yeah, so these are kind of playful things that I still like. That
Yeah.
keeping, folks. But you put down as a point, which kind of vends into this, the future of minis.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's something that I think about quite a lot. And I was definitely inspired by your discussion with Matthew last time, which had lots of wonderful threads through it. It was really good to listen to. On the one hand, I think about wanting to amass a certain amount of them now while the going's good, because I have a kind of a sinking feeling that in 10, 20 years time, they will be, environmentally, there'll be a no-go, an environmental no-go. So I like that idea of thinking, well, great, at least I have something to play with when I retire, or when I'm dead and my children can still play with them. At the same time, there's a kind of, I suppose, a bit of a problem-solving thing, which is probably nothing major, but thinking, well, what could you do? How could you do it? How could you create carbon-neutral miniatures? How could you, do the card figures, the flat card figures? Do they
just talk about
the
job? One of the things that I really enjoyed, particularly in the UK, but also when we got back here, I still have some of the bits of equipment, is actually casting my own miniatures. So most of the stuff, in fact, I think now exclusively the only metals you can buy in the UK, and I'm assuming here as well, maybe not here, but in the UK at least, you can't buy lead-based metals anymore. They require a slightly higher melting point. I think in many regards, they're actually a superior material, particularly for longevity. There's this phenomenon called lead rot, where lead literally turns into coal, or the appearance of coal. I have a couple of lead rot figures that I just maintain to show people what this thing is. But old lead, and the impurities in the old lead actually disintegrate over time, particularly if they're exposed to either air or certain chemicals that woods put out. So people that keep their miniatures in wooden cases, I kind of advise them not to do that whenever I've found them. So it is a deteriorating material. The pewter-based stuff, however, okay, so you've got to heat something up. Well, you can use solar for that, and obviously there is some off-gassing, but it's all manageable stuff. And my perspective is actually you could probably make carbon-neutral metal miniatures probably slightly easier than you could make carbon-neutral plastic miniatures.
I think maybe to go back to the kind of Inquisitor scale might actually be beneficial, because you could regain that sense of detail. So if in 50 years' time we're all playing with slightly bigger miniatures made out of a more, using more primitive casting processes or materials, maybe that would be a way around it.
Your preamble to this was interesting. Certainly when I arrived in the UK in the early 2000s, I was very much of the view that this thing was a dying thing. And as you say, it was my responsibility to find as many old miniatures and keep them safe, get them professionally painted and then keep them safe. And that was an interesting phenomenon. I talked to my wife, this notion of the fear of missing out that Matthew used in the last recording. I mean, you didn't know what the term was. It's part of a particular discussion associated with consumerism, but also it's for even post-millennials now, though it's a kind of millennial discussion associated with consumerism, which is how my wife exposed me to this idea. When I said to her, Matthew proposed, my wife's never met Matthew, but she's met actually Matthew's stepmother, funnily enough. We spent some quality time with her. She's an honorary aunt of mine, but she has such a warm, anyone who is 1 degree of separation from, my Auntie Helen is always a good person. So Matthew has gotten a certain degree of street cred with my wife. But when I said, do you think, and literally for me, I'm looking at a closet, which is my miniature collection, right? So I said to her, do you think this thing with the miniatures can be explained through the fear of missing out? And she kind of looked at me somewhat quizzically and she said, no, this is not the fear of missing out as it's used in broad consumerist thing. This is associated with a damaged childhood. And then went into her own particular analysis associated with this. But I think what's fascinating to me is that the fear of missing out is very much a consumerism in the now thing. But what you were describing here, which I've also felt, is this notion that there are parts of a time past which are so antithetical to whatever is modern and interesting, but still needs to be remembered in a very precise fashion that these figures, as your son's face conveys so perfectly in the video, are something which are transcendent and should be shared with another generation in a very playful and innocent and honest manner, which was obviously perhaps our early experiences with these things as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does absolutely, absolutely, and I totally agree. And in that sense, I hope that museums will take another step forward. There was at the British Museum a few years ago. There was a prehistoric art exhibition, Ice Age art, it was called, and it was very fine. In my opinion, it kind of recapitulated the flawed argument that modern humans were born in Europe because that's where the most archaeological excavations have taken place, and so on and so forth. So it was flawed in that sense. But of course, very nice pieces, and with Chauvet Cave and all of this, the dates are getting, pushed back, which is really good. But they had a workshop where you could go on a carving course and you would carve mammoth tusk, and that just seemed totally, I'd never thought of that before. It just seemed completely bizarre to me. And I said to my wife, they're doing a mammoth tusk carving workshop. It's only 75 quid. And she said, what are you talking about? I'll buy you a piece of mammoth tusk and you can carve it all you like at home. What are you thinking? But just the fact that there is presumably enough mammoth tusk knocking about for the British Museum to offer that as a workshop, I find
Do you think
incredible.
They'd actually give you a piece of mammoth tusk, or do you think they'd give you a piece of plaster that was hardened to the state of mammoth tusk?
It said mammoth tusk, and now obviously it would be that
That's how it gets people like you in, though, right? That's
well, okay, fine. Yeah, so so there's a little asterisk on there. Well, when I turn up, they say, well, it says ivory tusk.
Yes.
Actually, it's something else. But I imagine it would be the stuff in the ground, of course, or it'd have to be, wouldn't it? But what I mean to say is that it's somehow out of the whole ivory, the ethics of ivory debate. I guess it's already, mammoths are already dead. But yeah, I just thought that was an incredible thing. And I mean, I definitely had a fear of missing out at that moment, but I got over it quickly when it was pointed out how ridiculous I was being. But I think that sense of trying to keep things in the contemporary consciousness, and I think particularly with deep time issues, which I guess you've looked at with the Noble Ape type of thing, just to kind of keep turning over those long temporal ages. And I think the miniatures thing will be fascinating, at what point they kind of really start to get included in toy museums, or what Games Workshop do with their museum, which I haven't been to, but I'd be quite interested to. I wonder if they kind of, I don't know, I don't know if you've been, but I wonder if they really show the development, or if it's all about the new incarnations.
So many points that you've made. I'll say in 2004, I went to, I think it was called the Tate North. I can't remember whether it was in Manchester or Liverpool, but the Tate Gallery.
I think it's Liverpool, but
Liverpool. Yes, yeah. That's, you're confirming my thought then. They had an exhibit. It wasn't an exhibit. It was a maybe 4 feet by 4 feet glass enclosure that was a army hospital in the, it must have been the French Revolution, including a bunch of people getting guillotined and lots of surgeries and all this in 28mm miniatures. And that was the first example that I had seen of miniatures used in art, and it was shown as art. I followed this very closely, particularly associated with things in popular culture, the Antiques Roadshow, this kind of stuff. When miniatures start turning up in those kind of settings and get value based on it. And what interests me through this is whether painted miniatures or unpainted miniatures, depending on, a variety of things. But I guess I've been to Warhammer World once as maybe an anniversary gift. Maybe for our second or third anniversary, we went to Warhammer World. I went just at the period of time where the Space Hawk that I gave you They had this thing where you could go through all the old catalogues and they'd press you new miniatures for you. And I was about 6 weeks too late to get that old Space repressed. So that put some time frame on it. It's interesting, the history of modern Games Workshop. This is one of the luxuries that I am going to have in a few months' time, speaking with Ian Livingston and Steve Jackson.
Yeah.
Because they are very much interested in capturing the late 1970s and what created Games Workshop from that seed, completely removed from the corporation and all additional things from that. What interests me, and the reason I talk about psychedelia in this podcast, is that's one of the questions I want to talk to them about, is that they actually there was a fellow from California called Stan the Psychedelic Man, who, if you read Games Workshop history currently, features occasionally. He made plasticine and banana oil miniatures, so really quite an extreme in that regard. But also the early amount of both psychedelic use and also clearly, psychedelic thinkers that they employed. I mean, John Blanchet obviously has elements of that to him as well. So what fascinates me with early Games Workshop is how all these ideas came together to make this corporation, particularly because I'm always interested in this notion of creativity building off each other into a thing that sustains itself through this somewhat brutal age that we live in. And I think they have some unique insights into that. I will say, my experience, I didn't pay for the miniature museum portion of Warhammer World when I went, primarily because I had my wife there and she's like, are we done yet? Have we done this thing? I'm going to photograph you in front of the large space marine. Can we just move on? Nottingham as a place is well worth visiting anyway. They had an animatronic Robin Hood in the center of the city, which actually was slightly more memorable than Warhammer World, because it was actually really bad Disney done with a very particular UK perspective, which was beautiful. I would thoroughly recommend anyone going to Warhammer World just to see it as a thing.
I also have a fantasy that if I go into charity shops in Nottingham, that they will be littered with miniatures, because there's more miniatures per square metre per person in Nottingham than anywhere else in the country.
I'm glad you reminded me of this point. So the shields that are missing from the archers that you box don't go with the plastic Citadel things. They've just deteriorated. There's a company which I don't know what it trades under currently, but it's called Black Tree Design. And if you search for Black Tree Design, or in this country it's EOS, maybe BIS or something like that. Anyway, Black Tree Design is easy to remember. They make orc shields of a variety of different shapes in metal, which are very complementary and considerably more texturally interesting than the Warhammer plastics that have deteriorated over time.
That is a nice tip.
My view with regards to Nottingham is that you are dealing with a feeding frenzy. I find this in the San Francisco Bay Area. The best experience I've ever had with finding miniatures in the wild is associated with a place called St. Louis Obispo, which is on the California coast. It has a couple of universities nearby it, but it doesn't have the kind of level of deep nerd, I guess, that I would expect. In the San Francisco Bay Area, there are 6 major hobby stores. You would never find anything associated with old lead in any of them. Too much of a feeding frenzy. I assume the same would be the case in Nottingham. I went into this place which was called Neptune's Comics and Games. Maybe Neptune. Anyway, let's say it's called Neptune's anyway in St. Louis Obispo. They had 150 Necromunda era orcs, a bunch of early Imperial Guard, all metal. All unpainted, and they were selling them for 50 cents a piece.
Oh, okay.
So my perspective is actually you need to go where the miniature enthusiasts aren't. I had a similar experience. Adelaide, South Australia. There's a game store called Military Simulations. They have people's collections of well-painted miniatures for sale. Just absolutely stunning. I'm trying to get my wife. We're going to Australia in December. She's not going to Adelaide. She knows what my game is. She knows what the plan is. So, unfortunately, I'm not going to see that store for another, 3 years. But the trick is finding large populations with a small number of game stores. A large number of game stores and a large population, there's a feeding frenzy.
The other tragedy of it will be when people of our generation start dying and the children don't care. So they'll, you know, in the same way you go into a charity shop and you basically find dead people's stuff, right?
Yes.
That every so often you're going to end up with that, and you know there'll be thousands of Kickstarter special editions of things just sitting somewhere quietly in the corner of some charity shop that someone may or may not know about.
Or in the US, they'd just be melted down into bullets, right?
Okay, right, yeah.
So,
well, it might happen in Britain as well in the near future. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. Although, yeah, you need a few iterations of craziness before that becomes the case.
Mm.
Anyway, my perspective is exactly what you were doing. I also try to do it as much as possible, giving these things to another generation, allowing them. And this, one of the things, when I saw your son's face, I've got a pile of white dwarfs here, getting him those kind of things as well, you know, seeding this generation associated with the aesthetics, the philosophy, the elements. Let's see what happens. But yeah, it's interesting actually, when the economic downturn happened here, you could buy large Space Marine armies very, very cheaply. And, you know, it's interesting that even within economic drift, people will sell off these things. And I've had that experience. When I arrived in this country, I had a Games Workshop built internally within Games Workshop army, Imperial Guard army. I was running out of money. I had to go. So, you know, I think there are going to be a few iterations, but you're right. What happened, and it's already happening. I have a couple of deceased estate things that I picked up very cheaply. In fact, maybe even the orc that you hold is from a deceased estate thing that I saw and picked up. I got a majority of them painted. That one I think I had too many duplicates of, which is why you hold it currently. So it is fascinating to watch. But the main thing is just, how do we instill another generation? I mean, Matthew is obviously part of that dialogue with his son's D&D game as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, this fear of missing out issue, I think that the generosity that you show with your lead pile, which totally plays to everyone's desire to possess more things. But, you know, the fact that is this kind of open-handed, generous thing, which you also commented that Matthew had done similar things for you in the past, that seems to me the opposite of fear of missing out. It's a kind of joy of sharing. Or, you know, when you said that you give everything, you gave the figures away at the end of a campaign at work or something. Just this idea that that there's something more than consumerism happening with our games. And I think that's the real passion for a hobby, isn't it? Right? I mean, I have to say I'm only, you know, even having a hobby is a relatively new thing again for me. So I imagine it's like that in other hobbies as well, that you break through kind of expenditure and possibly even a status barrier, and you get into a more kind of reciprocal friendship type of group, where you share a common language, don't you? And that's also what we're doing with the games, and I don't know if that leads towards this issue of rule creation and empowerment, that we have shared languages, we have shared touchstones, we have shared concepts, and it's about that balance of which of those you want to pursue, or who gravitates towards which. So we can talk about Games Workshop a lot at the same time as anyone who will have listened to the podcast will know that, or at least our last episode and some of the other ones, that we don't like I go, you go. So
let's talk a little bit about this idea of empowerment through rules creation, because it's certainly something that you touched on. I wanted to explain a little bit more. For me, this comes from, and it's interesting because writing my own rules, writing computer software, putting out computer software open source, for me, it was a kind of continuum of this notion that when you create something, you're empowering yourself and you're empowering others to take what you have created and, you know, make their own versions, do their own manipulations, what have you. But that, for me, because these things are intertwined in my early experience, I forget to say explicitly, the notion of empowerment here comes from open source. In open source, the history was a company released proprietary software. It was always usually printer drivers. The company went out of business and you had the software that didn't work, right? You were disempowered by this thing. I look at my Warhammer historicals in the same way. This is unfortunately it's some part of the business which they just excluded from. Thankfully, there are small groups of people that still play these games, even though they're I go, you go. But the depth that Warhammer Historical's got into, particularly actually reframing a series of conflicts that have been very poorly done by the kind of legacy war games, is fascinating. But it's this notion that when you create something or when you participate in the creation process, you have a different relationship with the work than when you purchase the work and just play it, basically. And I think this is central in open source software. But when you said it, I thought, I've got to give this context to people who don't have the background in open source software and don't appreciate what that comes from. How did this resonate with you?
Well, so as a parallel example, as an academic, the things that I've uploaded and made freely accessible get read way more than anything that requires a login or the purchasing of a book or something like that. So I think there's definitely, even if you've got possible access to a login, it's so much easier, especially now, to click on a PDF or something like that, but also who's going to shell out 90 quid for an academic publication or travel to a library that you can access it and photocopy an article? It's kind of just a bit off the beaten track. So I guess people want things that are readily available, don't they? In order, hopefully, not just to kind of surface consume, but that actually they can spend their time then working on it in a more substantial way. I also think, within capitalism, to me, it just seems totally obvious that they need a certain degree of questionably freely available material, because nobody can shell out everything all of the time. And I think you find that in music and films. So branding, all of those kinds of things, all of those they need some people to be able to access some of the things at the periphery without going straight into the town centre and buying everything that they can possibly get their hands on. That's possibly going off a little on our own. I mean, the interesting thing would be with rules is if you were to buy something and then how you regain that empowerment, following your idea that by buying something you are somehow disempowered, that if you can re-empower yourself by regaining some agency over it.
So one of the fascinating things that I returned to with the squats, I sent some squats to you. They periodically come through my life, and I periodically, think about them in terms of the premier rule system discards an entire group within it. So is that there is an organic squat community that releases updates to the codexes and does a bunch of additional things. I think even in the paid for rules, you're going to have house rules, as we've discussed. You're going to have these things where the ridiculousness, be it the perception of magic, as Matthew raised last recording, or a variety of other concerns, will change your relationship with the rule system. And it's interesting, actually, I said in the last recording, if anyone plays competitive Warhammer 40,000 get in contact with me, looks like that person just left a 1-star rating on iTunes and didn't get in contact with me. So if another person wants to get in contact with me, I'm really interested in talking more. But I think what interests me through this is there are many levels to this thing. In software, which is the same as these games, you need to have a certain degree of competency, or you can fake it till you make it. I think you could fake it till you make it with games as well. But you need to have a certain sense of what probability means, what, multiple dice rolls mean, or you can create game mechanics that don't require those things. You can put in playing cards and a variety of other things that change probability, or use dungeon dice, use multi-sided, non-six-sided dice, which makes this thing a little bit easier. So there are a wide variety of ways that people can start exploring this thing, but it requires you taking anticipation that if you play these things out in the wild with other people, game systems that you've written, you're going to have to be constantly iterating over this rule system. Perfection is never shown when you're actively playing against people or playing with people, and you start seeing the shortfalls of the rules that you've written. That's one of the beauties of the thing, is that you constantly are thinking, okay, if I redo this, I've got to redo this part or this part or this part, or this isn't playing right, or this is playing too much against the players or too much in favour of the players. One thing that really fascinated me that you put down, which I think leads into this, is this notion of agency and cognition of characters in games. And the notion of kind of two extremes where you have, on one side, war games where you just have two competitors that are just hammering at each other. But on the other side, the notion of almost free-form role-playing in the most extreme case, but at least a majority of role-playing where there are, or there at least appear to be, so many choices that the player can have at any given state. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Sure. I think this. I've been mulling this over whilst thinking about these kind of what people call RPG light skirmish games or dungeon crawlers or those kinds of things, or like you're just playing Chaos or Inquisitor, like we talked about last time. There's this attempt to have skirmish RPGs, I suppose. So where the miniatures are much more than just some vague representation on the table. And it seems to me that mid ground between an RPG and a war game is a difficult thing to manage. And I wonder if this notion of the agency or cognition, supposed agency or supposed cognition of the characters is one element in that. So as you've just said, when you play a role play game, unless perhaps you're the dungeon master, you're probably playing one character. And so as Matthew talked about a little bit last time, I think, or you both did, there's yourself and then there's the character that you play. And there's obviously, there's a kind of disjunctive symbiosis or something, an alignment, a disjunctive alignment. So I can play a character who's much more agile than me. If I think about doing a perception check in real life, I don't roll any dice. So, there's this process that you're playing out. And most role play games, don't they tend to try and represent the range of the range of cognitive abilities that you gain, skills, or how you move through the world, what languages you have, et cetera, like that. Or even, the racial characteristics that you might have. So you're playing one to one, and you can really, if you like, you can declare, I want to think about something X, Y, or Z, and I will now roll to see if I manage to think that thought. And then you're confronted with the problem, if you fail, of, well, what am I thinking now if I didn't think what I wanted to think? As you said, when you have a war game, then you've just got these little figures that you move around. And whilst they're full of agency in the sense of doing things, killing things, moving, shooting, dodging, they're not really thinking in that. That's how I understand it. They're not really thinking in that sense of having emotional, ethical, making emotional or ethical decisions or having those kinds of responses. I thought maybe if a character wants to flee or something like that, it's routed or whatever you'd call it. That's kind of some notion of a sense of cognition. But again, why would it necessarily happen just when the rest of the team falls below 50% or whatever?
Well, let's talk a little bit about this, because one thing that's not explicitly written in the rules, but I've certainly put in the games of Just Playing Chaos, in fact, you're reminding me that I probably should explicitly talk about it in the rules, is this notion of surrender. And what you don't see in war games, I have a series of things that I'm kind of cataloguing about the bolt action rule system, like how this is distinct from history, is the notion of surrender. And actually surrender can be triggered by a variety of factors. It's not just a morale check, it's a variety of things that occur over time. And what I find fascinating, particularly with my use of surrender in the Just Playing Chaos games that I've mastered in one regard or another, is this notion that eventually you're dealing with humans fighting humans. You're not dealing with, there is certain manipulations, you do have certain class distinctions and various other things through Just Playing Chaos, but basically humans come to a point where they realize that whatever they're doing is just ridiculous and their life is worth more than the circumstance. Although the military tries to drum that out of soldiers, it is a very realistic phenomena of human consciousness embodied, which is rarely shown in war games because it's it's antithetical to the whole notion that you're just two people that will eventually get a points calculation at the end and work out who wins. But I think surrender actually would be a really fascinating element to include, in particular in the Second World War, but in a variety of other conflicts, as a means of actually addressing the nuanced emotion that you want to actually see in these circumstances. Does that make some sense to you?
It does. It does. It does. It does. And so then that's the question of, well, if we're coming from the war game side, do we want to increase the number of mechanics or stats that move towards an RPG kind of direction? You know, a more complex breakdown of the agency of these characters. And that's where I started to think about the numbers thing. So if we've got the RPGs on one side and a full-on war game battle on the other, as you get into that kind of skirmish place in the middle, or perhaps even, I was thinking, sorry, I should finish my sentence there. As you get in the middle zone with smaller numbers of characters, I think there's more of an opportunity perhaps to really bring in more of those RPG characteristics as the closer that you get to a kind of one-to-one alignment between the player and a character. And so that would also be interesting in terms of multiplayer games, which it sounds like you do at work, where, you know, it's not just two sides against each other. What you might have are 6 people in some kind of team formations, or just all in possible conflict. Is that how it goes with Just Plain
Certainly. I mean, typically they're all on the same side. One of the things that interests me actually is running opposing side interactions. The nature of doing this kind of game in a work environment is very, very interesting. I think I touched on it briefly through this, but maybe actually most of this audio I've removed, because in one of the conversations with Matthew, it got too deep and introspective into the nature of doing this in a work environment. So let me say this explicitly. I have to be very cognizant, and it has actually happened through these games, where there have been situations outside the appropriateness of what should normally go on in a work circumstance. And what's fascinating through this is how you resolve it quickly and, move on from that. So I'm very cognizant that when I'm framing these things, I am giving piecemeals of conflict strategy, more so when I was just running a D&D campaign, because there was a wide variety of possibilities, and that's where actually it played out, particularly because we had kind of transient characters that would come in and out, and all these kind of things. So I spend probably a minority of my time planning these games, working out how to resolve these circumstances if they in fact arise at work. It's very interesting. I mean, the last running of Just Plain Chaos, a work circumstance actually cancelled the game in parallel to this. So, I mean, this is the other thing of doing it in a work environment. My perspective, however, is it's substantially catharsis. The nature of the work that I do, the nature of the work that my peers do, has very limited means of resolving just in an environment. The ability to have playful interactions with my co-workers is a real luxury, and it is something that frames this whole thing. So to have direct conflict where, in a wargaming sense, I was thinking of bringing Blood Bowl for a start, just as a means of introducing these kind of games. It's not the kind of catharsis, I think, that the people are showing up for, every couple of weeks in the after-work games. That typically has me being the adversary, playing the adversary out, be it strange orcs, a bunch of crazy kind of human situations and other things in the D&D game. But in Just Plain Chaos, it's very much a sense of the other, of exploring an environment where you don't have a notion of the full picture because you've been raised in some kind of hive world like city where, your parents were substantial shop workers, your parents' parents were shop workers, you've been part of the organ, the mechanical organ of this thing, and then all of a sudden you were discarded and despised and looked at as being, possible revolutionaries in this circumstance. So, these kind of narratives are what I'm trying to explore. The direct competition thing, I mean, I was asked to do a demonstration Warhammer 40,000 game. Unfortunately, the fellow who was going to participate in that also was the fellow who came and stayed with me, and left in not particularly good terms last year.
Okay.
So unfortunately that didn't happen. My direct manager actually used to be an Orc player, a fanatical Orc player. Let's say a fanatical Orc player, if he's listening in. And and a number of his friends, because he grew up here, he grew up in the Bay Area. So all his friends were, of the same class. They all had their own army factions. It was funny, I met one of his friends and could predict immediately he was an Eldar player, right? There were these kind of beautiful things where even in a work, and we were working literally on a technical problem at another company. And when my manager said to me, "Oh yeah, I used to play Warhammer 40k," and I was like, he was an Eldar player, and immediately you knew. So it is interesting, this thing, but it has to, the competitive thing, I don't know, I'd love to be able to run like traditional war games. We have obviously working where I work, there are a bunch of series that come out that are historically based. There's a Dark Ages called, I think, Last Kingdom, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's set in that beautiful period of just before, where you still had Wessex and all these, kind of, I don't even know what we'll call them, like county countries type things.
Are they fiefdoms or?
Yeah, the fiefdoms, I guess, would be
something like.
Yeah, but particularly the Norse invaders and all this kind of beautiful stuff. So that plays up perfectly to 15mm war games. In fact, I have a bunch of. I literally look up and see the 15mm figures that I have ready for that to be played out. But I don't know. I don't know whether doing traditional war games at work would yield the same kind of catharsis as the kind of collective team against something, which is what I've run so far. We'll have to see how it plays out.
I've got a question for you about this. How do your colleagues respond differently when you play D&D compared to when you bring your own game?
So that was what was interesting. Look, the numbers dropped without question. Dungeons and Dragons has such is so central to nerd culture in this country. In fact, what was fascinating, the reason that I started the D&D campaign at work was because one of my co-workers had never played Dungeons and Dragons. And we all looked at him in shock, like, what were you doing in your teenage years? Like, what? Women and cars? Come on. So, anyway, he was, he's interested in vintage video games and arcade cabinets and things like that. So we kind of gave him a pass on that. But that was the reason that I started the campaign, was because one of our membership had not played D&D, whereas a majority of us had played D&D. And what was fascinating through that was that I was able to get the numbers with D&D. Just Plain Chaos was more eclectic. It was a series of things. It actually happened when I was in New Zealand. I was in New Zealand, and I got my work. We have annual feedback. Some of the annual feedback was, why aren't we playing games still at work? Like, you stopped this D&D campaign. We need this again. And at the same time, I was going to Adelaide, Victoria Miniatures, which are the miniatures I use for Just Plain Chaos. She's an Adelaide sculptor. She's a Slayer Sword winner as well. So those things kind of came together, and I had this existing novella which framed this setting. That's how that came together. You're right. We had a core of maybe 5 active players, a couple of stragglers that participate in that, versus 10, 12, 15 people for the D&D campaign.
And are they very conscious of somehow aiding you in developing the thing? Or what I guess I'm interested in whether you have different game master identities, whether you're playing the mass market D&D or whether you're playing your independent.
Oh, look, I'm playing my independent D&D. There's no way I'm playing the mass. And in fact, that was the frustration early on with a number of the players. Was that their concept of D&D had come from obviously new GMs that had bought the books, read through them, and then played campaigns. Look, Matthew, when I say this, I'm not joking. Watching Matthew Games Master, which was probably only 2 days worth of time, impacted me so much as a young GM. Historically, I had run games which were very much in the book series, and he showed me so many other little bits and pieces that it impacted me very strongly. And I use techniques still to this day that I had from my interaction with him. Because of who I was in my friendship group, there was a gentleman who used to GM. He stopped GMing, and I started GMing, and then I GM'd through till I was about 17 when I stopped. So the only feedback I had was from a small group of players. So when I came to the work game, I hadn't GM'd for, I don't know, I'm embarrassed to say how many years, but 20 odd years, more than 20 years. So I restarted where I was. Now the rules have evolved, obviously. And there were people that had played 3rd edition and 4th edition that came to these games. Well, kind of like you're playing kind of 1.5 edition, right? Like with the new rules, but you're playing the old mechanics in terms of your thinking. And then they just got into that. So we did have a few people that were like fiercely pointing at the player's handbook at various stages, like what it says that I could do in this thing. And then I think they caught themselves in this as well. We're dealing with people that are all in their, late 30s through to late 40s here. We're dealing with adults in this environment. And
go on.
And that changes the dynamic as well. And people realize that actually what they had experienced. And look, the original guy that I started the game for was part of an online game. So he had his Tom game and he had his online game. And I think he picked up another game through the process. So he, as an individual, realized that actually there were many different ways that this game could be played.
And what can I ask? What's the next step for your work gaming group? What's coming up next? Is there anything?
The hypothesis is the Chechen to get into a period of history that fascinates me, to get into a series of individual trajectories, to get into the notion of a highly created, somewhat repressed society that has substantial criminal elements, this kind of pious religiousness, but also a folk history which is really rich. And then this transition of invasion plus a whole lot of economic influences plus a bunch of additional stuff and how that system plays out. Now, this thing is considerably more complicated than I originally got into. And my hope is to have Chris Abbott back on this podcast to talk about this explicitly. I've passed some of this to Chris. The Palladium rule system I love. I want to run it in the Palladium rule system, but this might be bridged too far. So it could return to the Just Plain Chaos rule system with Chechen overtones.
Because if I understand that right, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because you want to make a game and you've done all of this research and you're getting all of the minis and all of that, but it seems like you can't decide if it is going to be a role play or if it's going to be a war game. Is that right?
I think this is the nature of where Just Plain Chaos landed. That originally it was designed as a role-playing game, but then I amassed some miniatures and the forcing function is what happens at work, right? I'm going to have to show up, look competent, and do something. So that will force it. That will force it any way it goes, and that's what I think is fascinating through this. There's a time component to it as well. I'm not going to play it in the summer. You're not going to get anyone attending. It's going to be dark and wintry, and we're going to get together over some bad pizza and a game board or whatever. It's usually one of these large meeting room tables. Just plunk a bunch of terrain there and, roll up some stats and play some games. So it's not going to be historically accurate. It's not going to have a series of these things. It's about fundamentally catharsis through a rule system. And whether that moves more towards traditional role-playing, it probably will initially. It has to initially, because the nature of the conflict was people really didn't start arming themselves and generating factions until a wide variety of really interesting permutations had occurred, particularly financial, but also just kind of standard gang affiliation stuff that occurred early on. So, my perspective is initially it is going to be way more role-playing, and then it's probably going to be skirmish wargaming. That's my thought.
Interesting. Well, I think we've done very well. We haven't used the word narrative once, I think.
I don't know about that. I'll have to go back and put in a bleep if need be, but yeah.
It could be. Which I think is really great. That was because my one thought was, I think to us in our little clique of anti-narrativists, to become positive and talk about other terms, other things, and not always this other thing that we don't necessarily need. I'm really just that it's not that useful. It's not that relevant necessarily. And so what you just described with the whole Chechen system and everything with Just Plain Chaos, all of that seemed to function without it needing to be a story in aimed at or a narrative in some sense, that it's this kind of pinball bouncing between all of these different situations or elements.
I mean, that's what I've always found with, I mean, in particular with D&D initially, and also how I've continued to play it. The play, the actual interaction of the characters creates a majority of this stuff. If you come with this long history and you got to read 10 books to understand the first thing about where you're going to be in this environment and all this kind of depth, it's kind of antithetical to the way these things actually play out. So,
well, that's also really disempowering, isn't it? Because the it's so prohibitive that people will stay away or won't fully invest or will be won't be as enthusiastic as they might be in a different setting. So exactly what you're saying about needing to read your office, read the room about what's going to be the most valuable or enjoyable experience for you. Very interesting stuff. Very interesting.
Barney, it has been an absolute pleasure. You've brought the birds, more birds than last time.
Yes, really. Well, I left the window a bit more open.
Very good.
Yeah, you don't mind. I
have this vision of the environment you live in, this utopian vision, particularly since the video footage has arrived. I don't want to be swayed in this regard. Let us do a similar recording in about a month's time. Maybe we can inject more Matthew Gibson in between. I'm hoping that Chris Abbott will have a chance to swing by and we can talk more about the Chechen rule system. It has been a pleasure as always, Barney. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Talk to you again soon.
Take care.